Today is the final chapter in the series we've had through the month of April called Here's the Church. And we've been talking about the different aspects of what it means to have a church, to be a church, to go to a church. Things beyond just the exterior of the assumptions we have around the concept of church. And so last Sunday we talked about Eastering, and then after church we went out and Eastered together by picking up some garbage in the field. That was really awesome. It was awesome to see our kids just as excited about that as if there were eggs with candy in them. Did you notice that? Yeah. And before that, we've been talking about the different ways that being the church is actually a call to be a gift to the world and not an insider's club. And so I would encourage you, if you missed any of the chapters along the way, hop on our YouTube channel, or you can even just scroll backwards on our Facebook timeline page wall thing, internet words, and you can look at some of the previous messages. Today, the title is that we're going to talk about the church as a revolution, and so I felt like we needed to invite our resident revolutionary to speak. If you've Patrick, why don't you come on down? So Patrick's going to be sharing today's message. And he's on the vision team, which is our big planning strategic group. And basically, anytime we want to hear what the furthest logical conclusion of the idea is, or someone to push our boundary or make us think twice about something, we're like, Patrick, what do you think? Because we know that's what we'll get from him. It's a blessing to have him as a friend and as a co-conspirator in the gospel. And so let's welcome Patrick this morning.
Good morning. How are we all doing? I was really glad to see that they were wrong about the snow last night, I guess. Crazy world. And by the way, I have never put the title of revolutionary on myself, so I'm just going to... But thank you. It's hard to believe that Easter was just a week ago. Things move quickly in our lives, just as they did 2,000 years ago. It wasn't long after Jesus' resurrection that his followers found themselves alone again. A lot happened in those days between his resurrection and his ascension. There were reunions, crazy superhuman feats. Jesus literally moved through a wall like an apparition, only not like an apparition, more like subatomic particles contracting and expanding. I don't know what I'm talking about. There were moments of joy, moments of forgiveness and acceptance, moments of incredible faith, and moments of doubt. And most of that just happened in just a few moments when the women at Jesus' tomb discovered him. Not dead and covered in embalming clothes, but alive, and very unlike a zombie. Not at all hungry for brains, but probably actually really hungry. I want to focus our attention for a moment on what I believe to be one of the most important moments or events that occurred in that in-between time. I know this sermon is about church's revolution, and for a while it might not be clear that I'm on subject, but please stick with me. We're not just getting there, we're already there. It'll make more sense in a little bit. Let's focus our gaze on a character that we too easily gloss over. This is partly because we probably identify with him the most, and so naturally we want to deny it. And partly it's because the story is more complicated than we know. Partly because it seems so obvious, and so we don't have to spend too much time on it. And really, if we're honest, because we think it's so obvious, we recount the tale the same way we always have. I'm talking about a man named Thomas. You probably know him as Doubting Thomas. It's a name that has become a kind of mantra that we repeat over and over until it has no meaning. Thomas has evolved into a stand-in anytime we want to talk down to people about how easy we think faith is, anytime we want them to see how ridiculous it is that they don't get it. I mean, Jesus says to him, "Because you have seen, you believe. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed." Well, that settles it, Thomas, you infidel, you monster, you paragon of unbelief. We shall henceforth declare that we will in no wise be like you. Okay, I guess we can move on. Or maybe not so fast. So Thomas is not ready to just take his friend's word that the greatest event in the history of the world has just taken place. He's just supposed to accept it. Jesus really came back to life? Really? Are you all delusional? Because that doesn't just happen. I'll believe it when I see it. That's pretty much what Thomas was saying. And for that, he's forever the bad guy. Doubting Thomas. What a loser. You have to actually see Jesus' wounds. You have to touch his physical body. How much is enough for you? What I want to propose, and what I like to believe, is that Thomas was onto something. That Thomas understood what was going on, whether or not he could articulate it. I think his response to the events at hand showed that he understood better than anyone else the ramifications of Jesus' resurrection. That's why Jesus lets him touch the scars. Not because he feels bad for him or because he must treat him with kids' gloves. The reason is because Jesus knows what Thomas knows. If the resurrection is not physical, if Jesus didn't raise to life with real skin just like Thomas's, if the wounds were not sealed with scar tissue, if Jesus' hands could not be held, if his body could not be embraced, if his lips could not be kissed with brotherly love, then the resurrection was meaningless, and everything that Jesus had taught was for nothing. Because at that moment, everything was at stake. These papers would bother me. The whole universe was caught in the balance, and proof of life, physical skin life, was necessary to keep the scales from tipping back in the direction of death. We should remember Thomas not just when we need to decide whether doubt is okay or necessary or whatever, however true it may or may not be. We should never think of Thomas simply as a doubter. Instead, we should forever remember him as the guy who knew that without Jesus' physical body, there could be no future Jesus followers because Jesus would no longer be a legitimate leader to follow. His message would be as dead as the body in the tomb. And it couldn't be just spiritual or supernatural resurrection. It's in the words of a song by the band Dawes, "If heaven is all that's promised to me, why don't I pray for death?" Earlier I said that we're not just getting there. That is to the heart and soul of this message, but that we're already there. What I meant is that Thomas, in that moment with Jesus, where he's poking and prodding, is one of the clearest pictures of the birth of the church. And what I hope I can make clear is that something revolutionary happened in that moment, that Thomas finally knew for certain that the world had really changed. The old world was gone and the new had come. Life had won out over death, and nothing could ever be the same. The story of the church starts way before Thomas, way before Jesus, way before Rome came in and occupied Israel. It starts at the very beginning of time. At the beginning was balance and harmony. There was this pure relationality, a peculiar word that insinuates that all the parts were working together and that they had personality and their own unique characteristics. We have Trinity here, plus the hosts of heaven. And then, before the world was even formed, the Bible tells us this punk named Satan has to muck things up. He defies the harmony and balance, defies the relationality for his own individuality, which, we should note, was never in question, as if he was expected to be just a copy of a copy of a copy. His own hubris leads to his downfall, and he takes as many with him as will follow. Relationality is broken into bits by a wresting of power. A new order is established, or so he would have us believe. His first order of business is to bring death into the world of relationality's creation, us, humans. And boy, did he succeed. Whether you read this story as myth, which doesn't mean it isn't true, or not doesn't matter, but the point is still the same. Those who would claim power for themselves have no way to maintain that power without enslaving others and can only claim legitimacy by way of threat of death and violence. Relationality gets flipped upside down and broken apart. The world is askew. We don't have time to go through the whole history this morning, although I think it could be fun. But it would take a while, and there's this book that you can read that tells it better than I can. It's called the Bible. I hear it's a bestseller. So I want to point out just one story. And I want to bring this up because it is directly related to where we're ultimately headed. After Adam and Noah and Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and the whole Egypt thing and Moses and the desert and finally the promised land, after God has been there the entire time, dropping food from the sky and drowning armies and peering in bushes and in a pillar of cloud and a pillar of fire. After all of that, the children of Israel look around and see that over there, those people over there have this really cool new shiny thing. It's called a king, and by golly, do they have to have one too. God, being no one's fool, says, and I have to say it's obvious that God knows what's going to end up happening, even though it's clearly a bad idea. God says, okay, let's see what happens. I won't even tell you I told you so, even though I told you so. And spoiler, God tells them, I told you so. But he lets it happen, and as predicted, it goes bad. Not super bad at first, but progressively worse and worse and worse, and just read the book. But the history of God's people is the story of a constant struggle to understand power. It's political. It's a constant battle against the desire to be like everybody else and to accept the status quo and to accept the way that those guys over there say that things are. And the history of God's people is the story of how every time they listened to those guys over there, they failed. Every time. It even affected their expectations of God's promised help, the Messiah, because they conceived of the Messiah in the terms set by those in power. Messiah would be a great conquering hero. He would come in and he would save the day and defeat Rome. They would have a king of kings, a military genius, a noble general who would give Caesar his due. We all know that what they got was something entirely different. The Messiah did not take the form of those in power, the rulers, the principalities. The Messiah came as a baby. And then he grew up and became a teacher of the people, and he ultimately was killed by the religious and government leaders because he was a threat to their legitimacy. And of course, we remember what happened next. We just celebrated it a week ago. This brings us back to Thomas. He had to see Jesus' body because he had so many reasons to expect that the baby turned political insurrectionist was gone and never coming back. The evidence was clear. The precedent had been set so many times before as the game continued to be played by the same rules with the same people winning every time. So imagine the surprise to find out that this time it was different. The world was suddenly and inexplicably turned on its head. Anything was possible. Jesus hung around for about a month or so after his resurrection, and then he was gone. His followers watched him go up into the clouds, and they were left to sort out what to do with this new world order. The church was born in a little room full of a small group of people who had seen the risen Jesus. He had promised them he would send help, and he did. And it's incredible what happened in that room. You see, the birth of the church was not the establishment of a denomination or the selection of a pastor, the erection of a cathedral, the music of an organ, or a list of rules to follow to be part of the in crowd. They started speaking languages that they had never spoken before. The church was birthed in a confusion of language, the direct result of the Spirit of God breathed into the people in that room. It was the signal that the saying was true: there is neither Greek nor Hebrew, slave nor free, male or female, rich or poor. In that room, the lines were blurred to the point where the most basic part of how we are distinguished as humans apart from the other animals, that is, our ability to use language, and the most basic way that we are divided and unable to relate to each other, that is, our use of different languages, were completely discombobulated. The divisions were erased. That sounds like some kind of revolution. What happens to the early church is a continuation of these crazy reversals of our expectations concerning our living in the world. We expect that we are defined by language, and it goes haywire. We expect that we have our possessions and that we're defined by what we own, and then these people give up everything that they have and start sharing. We expect that certain people just naturally belong in particular hierarchical positions of power and authority. And they say it that way, too, to make it confusing. And then these people start acting like equals over here. Women are allowed to be involved in unheard of ways. When you look at what the early church did in the wake of Jesus' resurrection, in the wake of their being filled with the Spirit, you can't help but to stare wide-eyed in shock. You cannot take their actions and to come to any other conclusion that they were living in a different world than everyone else. Here we have come back full circle to the whole point of this message of church as revolution. How should we define the church? What does it mean to be the church? I think it's this. The church is a people who live as though the world is right side up, despite all the evidence that it's upside down. We live in expectation of resurrection by living as though we already are resurrected. We live heaven on earth now. Do you know why we live as though the world is right side up? Because it is. We're just really bad at living it. We as the church must continually live in a state of revolution, because if we don't, we easily fall prey to the status quo. We have to be reminded of what Jesus said. The first shall be last, and the last shall be first. Love your enemies and pray for those who would hurt you. Seek first the kingdom of God. Give to Caesar what is Caesar's, and God what is God's. All of the things that were in the scripture about the merciful and those who seek peace. Jesus' message was political. He was constantly talking about claims of power, and he was constantly questioning preconceived ideas of who was acceptable and who was not. He was a revolutionary who unseated the greatest enemy the world has ever known, death itself. And in raising back to life, he established that our material reality matters. The early church showed that they had received the message loud and clear when they gave everything away and made sure that no one was left needing, no matter who, no matter what. We here at Northern Light try to follow their example. We're not perfect, not even close, but we're working on it. We're practicing resurrection. We're doing our best to stand on our heads. And there's something about people who are doing headstands. They always look weird, sure, but more importantly, they see the world differently than everyone else. In seeing the world differently, in acting differently, in making ourselves fools for Jesus, as we give up our claims to power, as we find our identity not in what we have, but in who we are together as the church, we are not simply working for a revolution, we are a revolution. The church is a people who live as though the world is right side up, despite all the evidence that it's upside down. Take that with you today. Let it sink in, and let it be a buffer against the lies that surround us. But also, let it be the fight in us. Let it lead us to action as we act justly, love mercy, and walk humbly with God.